Firefighter donates time to rebuild flooded neighborhood. The gratitude he receives is heartwarming and inspires the community. Thaddeus Quinn stood amid the ruins of a once vibrant neighborhood, the remnants of a house crumbling beneath his feet. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood and earth, a lingering reminder of the flood that had swept through, leaving destruction in its wake. He felt the weight of a promise he made to himself after that fateful day, a promise to help rebuild not just homes, but lives. As he stared at the empty frames and broken walls, he wondered if he could truly keep that promise. "Isn't it a shame?" came a soft voice from nearby. Thaddeus turned to see Mrs. Eloise, an elderly woman sitting on a porch that had seen better days. Her eyes were clouded with sorrow, reflecting the loss of her home and the memories it contained. "I raised my children in that house," she said, her voice trembling. Every corner held laughter, every room a story. Thaddeus felt a tug at his heart. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Eloise. I promise, we will rebuild it stronger." "Stronger," she echoed, a hint of skepticism in her tone. "But can we rebuild what was lost?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Thaddeus shifted his weight, suddenly aware that helping her was about more than just physical labor. It was an emotional commitment to restore hope. "I believe we can, together," he replied, meeting her gaze with unwavering sincerity. As they spoke, Thaddeus felt a warmth spreading within him. Mrs. Eloise's stories filled gaps in his heart that he didn't know existed. He realized that this journey would require compassion and understanding. "What color will you paint your new house?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Lavender," she said, her eyes lighting up momentarily. "It was my mother's favorite color. She always said it reminded her of the sky at dawn." "Then lavender it shall be." Thaddeus smiled, feeling a spark ignite in their conversation. Just then, the sound of laughter echoed from further down the street. Thaddeus turned to see a young woman splattered with paint, her hair a vibrant shade of green. She skipped over, an easel tucked under her arm, and introduced herself as Juniper. "I'm here to bring some color back to this place," she announced with infectious enthusiasm. "Color?" Mrs. Eloise raised an eyebrow, skepticism returning. "Absolutely. I want to paint murals on the houses we rebuild. Art can heal, you know?" Juniper's eyes sparkled with passion. "Imagine a world filled with joy and creativity instead of this gray devastation." Thaddeus felt a thrill at the idea. "That sounds amazing. We could turn this place into a canvas of hope." Mrs. Eloise hesitated, her brow furrowed. "But what if the neighbors don't want it? Change can be hard for some." Juniper's smile faltered for a moment before she replied, "Change is necessary for growth. We can inspire them, show them what's possible." Thaddeus nodded, feeling their shared determination. Yet, a cloud of doubt lingered in the air. Would the community embrace this new vision? He sensed the weight of tradition pressing down on them, a resistance to the unfamiliar. "Let's start small," he suggested. "Maybe we can gather everyone for a meeting. We can present the idea and see how they feel." Mrs. Eloise sighed, her gaze drifting back to the ruins. "Change can be terrifying, Thaddeus. But perhaps it's time for us to step out of the shadows." Juniper clapped her hands together, excitement bubbling. "Yes, together, we can create something beautiful." Thaddeus felt a surge of hope. As he looked at the two women, he realized this journey would be about more than just reconstruction. It would be about forging bonds and healing hearts. The weight of his promise felt lighter as he envisioned a neighborhood united in resilience. "Let's do it," he said, determination in his voice. "Let's bring life back to this place, one brushstroke at a time." As the sun rose higher in the sky, Thaddeus Quinn stood in front of Mrs. Eloise's house, ready to start the repairs. The smell of fresh paint and wood filled the air, but he felt a mix of excitement and pressure. Just as he lifted his tools, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey there, need some help?" Thaddeus turned to see a young woman with wild, colorful hair and paint-splattered clothes. She had a bright smile that seemed to light up the gloomy surroundings. "I'm Juniper," she said, extending her hand. "I'm an artist. I want to paint murals on the houses that are being rebuilt. It'll bring some joy back into this place." Thaddeus shook her hand, intrigued. "I'm Thaddeus. That sounds like a great idea. I think the community could really use some color right now." Juniper's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Yes. Just imagine vibrant flowers and uplifting scenes all over the neighborhood. We can transform these houses into a canvas of hope." As they spoke, Thaddeus felt a new energy buzz between them. He had been focused on the physical work of rebuilding, but Juniper's vision opened his mind to something deeper. "I'd love your help," Thaddeus admitted, "but I worry about the residents. Some might not welcome change." Juniper nodded, understanding the challenge. Change can be scary for people, but art has a way of breaking down walls. Once they see the beauty we create, they might feel differently. Motivated, Thaddeus agreed. "Let's do it together." Over the next few days, Juniper and Thaddeus worked side by side. Juniper painted bright flowers on the walls of the houses, and Thaddeus repaired roofs and windows. With every stroke of the brush, Juniper brought life back into the neighborhood. One afternoon, while they were taking a break, Thaddeus watched as Juniper painted a large mural of a sun rising over a field of flowers. "Why do you want to do this?" Thaddeus asked, genuinely curious. Juniper paused, her brush hovering above the canvas. "I grew up in a broken home. My family struggled, and art was my escape. It helped me find beauty in the darkness. I want to give that feeling back to others." Thaddeus admired her passion. "That's powerful. I think we all need something to hold on to right now." As the days passed, the community began to notice the changes. Children laughed and played as they watched Juniper paint. Some adults even stopped to chat with her, intrigued by the bright colors splashing across the houses. However, not everyone was pleased. On their way to the local store, Thaddeus overheard a group of older residents talking in hushed tones. "What is that girl doing? This is not the time for murals," one man grumbled. Another woman added, "We should focus on rebuilding, not painting rainbows on the walls." Thaddeus felt a pang of worry. He knew that not everyone embraced change, and Juniper's presence stirred up mixed feelings. Later that day, he brought up his concerns with Juniper. "I heard some people aren't happy about the murals. They think it distracts from the rebuilding." Juniper sighed, her usual spark dimming. "I understand, but art is part of healing. It's not just about the walls. It's about bringing people together." Thaddeus thought for a moment. "Maybe we should hold a community meeting. Let's invite everyone to see what we're doing and share our vision." "Great idea," Juniper replied, her enthusiasm returning. "We can create a space for people to express their feelings. Maybe then they'll understand." With renewed determination, Thaddeus and Juniper began preparing for the meeting. They wanted to show the community that rebuilding was not only about structures, but also about healing hearts and minds. As they painted together, Thaddeus felt a bond growing between them. They shared their fears and dreams, each finding strength in the other. He realized that this journey was not just about his promise to help Mrs. Eloise. It was about uplifting the entire community. And as the colorful murals began to take shape, Thaddeus hoped that the vibrant colors would also brighten the hearts of those who had lost so much. In the face of adversity, perhaps art could be the bridge that connected them all. As Thaddeus Quinn stood on the porch of Mrs. Eloise's house, he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. News had spread through the neighborhood that Mrs. Eloise's son, Marcus, was back from prison. While Thaddeus wanted to support Mrs. Eloise, he could feel the tension rising among the other residents. "Do you think he's really changed?" a neighbor named Greg asked, his voice laced with doubt. "People like him don't just turn over a new leaf." Thaddeus turned to Greg, trying to keep his tone calm. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Greg. We can't judge him before we even meet him." Greg frowned, crossing his arms. "It's not just about him. It's about our safety. What if he brings trouble back to this place?" As the sun set, Casting long shadows over the neighborhood, a meeting was called to discuss the community's concerns. Thaddeus felt a mix of apprehension and determination as he made his way to the community center. Inside, chairs filled with anxious faces awaited the start of the discussion. Mrs. Eloise sat at the front, her hands wringing together. Thaddeus could see the worry etched on her face as she glanced around the room. "Thank you all for coming," Thaddeus began, standing up to address the crowd. "I know there are concerns about Marcus, but I believe we should give him a chance to show us who he really is." "Why should we?" a woman in the back shouted. "He's just going to bring chaos. We've worked hard to build this community back up, and we don't need someone who might ruin it." Thaddeus felt his heart race. "But we are not the same people we were before the flood. We have all changed. We've lost so much. Shouldn't we allow others the opportunity to change as well?" The room fell silent for a moment, and Thaddeus could see the mixed expressions on the faces of his neighbors. Some were thoughtful, while others remained resolute in their fears. "I just want to protect my family," Greg spoke up again. "I can't just ignore what he's done." Mrs. Eloise finally spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "I know my son has made mistakes. He is not perfect, but he is my son. I have lost everything, and I am trying to rebuild my life. Can't you see that he deserves the same chance?" Thaddeus watched as tears filled her eyes. Her vulnerability stirred something within him. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on the room, urging everyone to listen. Just then, a young man stood up from the back, his face earnest. "I've been in Marcus's shoes. I've made mistakes too. When I got out, I was scared. People looked at me like I was a criminal, even though I wanted to change. It took time for me to find my place again. If we don't give him a chance, we may lose someone who could become part of our community." A few heads nodded in agreement, but others remained skeptical. Thaddeus sensed the division growing, like a crack in the foundation of their community. "Maybe we could start with small steps," Thaddeus suggested, trying to bridge the gap. "Let's have Marcus come to the next community event. He can introduce himself, and we can see if he can help us rebuild, not just houses, but trust." "I don't know," Greg muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not sure the others will agree to that." "Let's vote," Thaddeus proposed. "If you're willing to give him a chance, raise your hand." One by one, hands began to rise, though some remained down. Thaddeus felt a glimmer of hope, but also the weight of the challenge ahead. As the meeting concluded, Thaddeus caught Mrs. Eloise's eye. "Thank you for standing up for him," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I believe in second chances," he replied softly, knowing that this journey would not be easy. The battle between fear and hope was far from over, but he was ready to fight for what was right, even if it meant facing the storm within his own community. Walking home that night, Thaddeus pondered the path ahead. Change would require patience, understanding, and above all, a commitment to unity. He felt the stirrings of a plan forming in his mind, one that could bring the neighborhood together, as he held on to the belief that healing starts with a single step. The sun rose gently over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow on the freshly painted houses. Thaddeus Quinn stood at the center of the empty lot, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Today was the day he had organized a community event to showcase the progress of the rebuilding efforts. He hoped it would bring everyone together to celebrate their hard work and to heal the wounds left by the flood. As the morning wore on, neighbors began to trickle in. Some carried food, while others brought chairs and blankets. The air filled with chatter and laughter, a stark contrast to the silence that had lingered for too long. Thaddeus smiled as he watched Mrs. Eloise arrive, her face brightening at the sight of the gathering. "Good morning, Thaddeus," she said, her voice warm like the sun. "I can't believe how far we've come." "Good morning, Mrs. Eloise," he replied. "It's all thanks to you and everyone here. This is a day to celebrate." As the event progressed, Thaddeus took a moment to step back and observe the scene. Children played in the grass, their laughter ringing out like music. Neighbors exchanged stories, sharing memories of the past and hopes for the future. It was a moment of unity, and he felt a swell of pride. When it was time for the speeches, Thaddeus stood at the front, a microphone in hand. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the moment. Thank you all for being here today. We have faced many challenges, but together we have shown strength and resilience. Let's keep this spirit alive as we continue to rebuild not just our homes, but our community. The crowd clapped, and Thaddeus felt a spark of hope ignite within him. As he stepped aside, he gestured for Mrs. Eloise to take the microphone. She stood up slowly, leaning on her cane, and the crowd quieted down. I want to thank each and every one of you, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. We have lost so much, but we have also gained a sense of togetherness. It is in our hearts that we find the strength to move forward. Her words resonated deeply with the crowd, and Thaddeus could see nods of agreement among the neighbors. As she spoke, a sense of healing washed over everyone present. Then, to Thaddeus's surprise, Mrs. Eloise motioned for her son to join her at the front. He had been standing off to the side, nervous and unsure. The crowd held its breath as he took the microphone from her hand, his hands trembling slightly. Hi everyone, he said, his voice shaky but determined. I know many of you don't know me well. I'm Mrs. Eloise's son, and I just want to say, I'm working hard to change my life. I made mistakes, but I'm not that person anymore. A hush fell over the crowd as they listened intently. Thaddeus could feel the tension in the air, a mix of hope and uncertainty. He took a small step forward, ready to support Mrs. Eloise's son if needed. I understand that you have concerns, he continued, his voice growing stronger. But I ask you to give me a chance. I want to be part of this community, to help rebuild what I broke. I want to show you that people can change. Thaddeus noticed a few faces soften in the crowd. He felt a glimmer of hope that maybe the community could move past its fears and prejudices. Thank you for listening, he finished, stepping back and looking at his mother, who smiled proudly at him. The crowd erupted in applause, and Thaddeus felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. As the event continued, Thaddeus watched as people began to approach Mrs. Eloise's son. They offered handshakes and warm smiles, slowly breaking down the walls of suspicion that had existed for so long. Thaddeus felt a sense of triumph in his heart. Today was not just about rebuilding houses, it was about rebuilding lives and relationships. The community event ended with laughter and music, but the most important thing was the change in the air. Thaddeus realized that they were not just restoring their homes, they were nurturing a bond that would help them face the future together. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the right path. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting a warm light on the remnants of homes that had once told stories of lives lived. After the community event, a palpable shift hung in the air. Thaddeus Quinn stepped outside, feeling a renewed energy among the residents. He watched as small groups began to form, some approaching Mrs. Eloise's son, Marcus, with tentative smiles and outstretched hands. Hey Marcus, called out Greg, a local shop owner. Can I help you with anything around here? For a moment, Marcus hesitated, his face a mix of surprise and wariness. Sure, he replied, glancing back at his mother, who sat on the porch with a gentle smile. I could use some help fixing the fence. Thaddeus felt a warmth in his chest as he witnessed this moment. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the neighborhood meeting just days before. He approached Mrs. Eloise, who looked on with pride. Look at them, she said softly, her eyes sparkling. They're reaching out. It's a start. It is, Thaddeus agreed, his heart swelling with hope. This is what we need. Connections. As the day unfolded, Thaddeus moved around the neighborhood, witnessing more interactions. He saw Sarah, a mother of 3, engaging Marcus in conversation while her children played nearby. You know, I heard you're an artist, she said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Maybe you could show my kids how to paint? Marcus's face brightened at the suggestion. I'd love to. Painting is a great way to express yourself. Thaddeus smiled, realizing that these small gestures were building bridges where walls had once stood. He continued to observe, feeling the weight of his promise shift from just rebuilding homes to rebuilding lives. Later that afternoon, Thaddeus found himself beside Juniper, who was sketching designs for the mural they planned to create together. She looked up, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement. Thaddeus, I have an idea. What if we include symbols from everyone's story in the mural? It could represent our journey together. That's a great idea, Juniper, he replied, feeling inspired. We could have a tree for growth, hands for connection, and maybe even a sun for hope. Yes, and I think we should invite everyone to contribute, she suggested, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. It would be a way for everyone to feel included. Thaddeus nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. Let's set a date. We can have a community painting day. As they discussed plans, Thaddeus couldn't shake the feeling of transformation around him. The neighborhood was beginning to feel more like a community, a place where people cared for one another. The next few days buzzed with activity. Thaddeus helped organize the mural painting day, and word spread quickly. On the chosen day, families gathered with paintbrushes and buckets of color. Laughter filled the air as children splashed paint on the canvas, their joy infectious. Thaddeus watched as Mrs. Eloise, holding a paintbrush in her hand, approached Marcus. Would you like to paint with me? She asked, her voice warm and inviting. Marcus nodded, a smile breaking across his face. Sure, I'd like that. As they painted together, Thaddeus saw the barriers between them dissolve. This act of creativity was more than just colors on a wall. It was a moment of healing. He felt a surge of hope as he realized that this mural was not simply a piece of art, but a symbol of their shared growth and newfound understanding. As the sun began to set, the mural took shape, a vibrant tapestry of colors and stories woven together. Thaddeus stood back, taking in the sight. The neighborhood felt alive, bursting with energy and connection. Look at what we've created, Juniper exclaimed, her face glowing with pride. It's beautiful, Thaddeus replied, feeling a sense of fulfillment. This is just the beginning. In that moment, he understood that change was not just about rebuilding structures. It was about building relationships, understanding, and acceptance. The mural was a reflection of their journey, a testament to the power of coming together. As the community gathered around their creation, Thaddeus felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had not only begun to heal their homes, but had also started to mend their hearts, and in that unity, hope blossomed anew. As the neighborhood flourished, Thaddeus Quinn felt a sense of joy he had not known before. The air was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing, a stark contrast to the silence that had once surrounded the ruins. Each day, he watched as neighbors greeted one another with smiles, their faces brightening the once dim streets. It was a beautiful sight to see how empathy and kindness had transformed this place. One afternoon, while Thaddeus was painting the fence of Mrs. Eloise's home, he noticed a group of residents gathered near the community mural. Juniper was leading a workshop, teaching children how to add their own touches to the artwork. Thaddeus paused to watch, a smile creeping across his face. The mural now depicted scenes of hope and resilience, with splashes of color representing the spirit of the community. "Hey, Thaddeus," called Juniper, waving him over. "Come and see what the kids are creating." Thaddeus walked over, feeling lighter as he approached. "What are you all working on?" he asked, kneeling down beside a little girl named Mia, who was painting a bright yellow sun. "I'm making a sun to show that we can always find light, even in the dark," Mia said proudly, her eyes sparkling. "That's beautiful, Mia," Thaddeus replied, feeling a warmth in his heart. "You're right. We need that light." As he watched the children, he realized how the bonds formed during the rebuilding process had strengthened the community. Neighbors who once barely spoke were now working together side by side, sharing meals and stories. Thaddeus could see the change in everyone, including himself. He had found a family among these people. Later that day, Thaddeus sat down with Mrs. Eloise on her porch. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude and peace. "Thaddeus," she began, her voice soft but strong, "I never thought I would feel this happy again. You have brought so much to this community." Thaddeus smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "It's not just me, Mrs. Eloise. It's all of us. We've learned to lean on each other." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "You know, my son is doing well. He's been helping with the mural. It makes my heart swell to see how people are starting to accept him." Thaddeus felt a sense of pride for Mrs. Eloise's son, too. "He deserves this chance," he said. "We all do. That's what this community is about now, understanding and support." As the evening descended, the sounds of music floated through the air from the community center, where a celebration was being held. Thaddeus and Mrs. Eloise joined the crowd, enveloped by the warmth of laughter and friendship. He noticed how people danced together, their worries fading away with each beat of the music. "Look at them," Thaddeus said, gesturing to the couples twirling and the children laughing. "This is what we fought for." Mrs. Eloise smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "You have done more than rebuild a house. You have rebuilt our lives." In that moment, Thaddeus felt a profound sense of connection. He understood that the real essence of rebuilding was in the relationships they nurtured. Each person had a story, a burden, and together they created a tapestry of hope. As the night wore on, Thaddeus stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the community celebrate their achievements. He reflected on how far they had come. The pain of the past had not been erased, but it had transformed into something beautiful. Kindness had indeed changed lives. "Hey, Thaddeus," a voice called out, breaking his reverie. It was Juniper, her face aglow with excitement. "Come dance with us." With a laugh, Thaddeus joined her, feeling the music fill his spirit. He danced freely, surrounded by friends, knowing this was just the beginning of a brighter future. As the stars twinkled above, Thaddeus Quinn felt a profound truth settle in his heart. Together, they had woven a new fabric of life, stronger and more vibrant than before, all because they chose to connect. Share this story if you believe that community and kindness can transform lives. Leave a comment about a time when you experienced the power of connection in your life. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.